is to review.
You're going to keep going, Steve.
I gotta get that screen out of the way, sorry. The purpose of today's workshop is to provide an overview of the fair housing needs and the housing programs, as well as climate change and disadvantaged communities, and to get your input on some of these issues. Next, is that the next one? Again, I'm Steve Sizemore. As part of our consultant team, we have Rima Chakra from Rincon Planning Company and Jason Montague, who will be part of the team that's working with us. Again, the city's team will be Inez Alvarez, Diana Garcia, and Frank Lopez, and myself. We're really going to be here to explain the program to you, to talk a little bit about this process the city's taking, and really to get your input to help us develop a program that'll be consistent with state laws and guidelines, as well as reflect what the community is desiring to get. So that concludes my part in this discussion, and we'll turn it over to the consultants, and we'll be able to answer questions as we go along with the meeting. Thank you, Rima.
Steve, yeah, my name is Rima Chakra. I'm the project manager with Rincon Consultants, the consulting firm that's assisting the city with the housing element update, as well as the safety element and environmental justice element update. As many of you, I'm sure, have noticed, we have translation in Chinese traditional language along the top of your screen. Please keep in mind, this is being prepared by a third-party translator, so there might be some inaccuracy, but we're sort of putting forward our best reasonable effort to make sure it's available for folks. We also do have the option for those that are Spanish speakers to join a breakout room and listen to the present, or be able to see the translation in Spanish. If you are interested in joining a Spanish breakout room, you can raise your hand and we'll move you to the breakout room. If you see along the bottom of your screen, there is a raise hand feature. And I'll also give Adriana a chance to announce that in Spanish.
Thanks, Rima. Buenas tardes. Si desea unirse a una sala de traducción en español, por favor presione el icono de la mano levantada para transferirle. Para las llamadas telefónicas, presione estrella 9 para levantar la mano.
So Sarah, anyone raise their hands to move to a breakout room at this time?
No hands raised at this time.
Okay, all right, we'll all stay in the main room. We will also be providing this slide deck on the project website, and you should be seeing a link from Sarah, who's operating as our moderator today. So there will be a Spanish translated slide deck, as well as a traditional Chinese translated slide deck available on the project website, as well as this English slide deck too. So those are resources. As you noted at the beginning, this workshop is being recorded. We wanted to provide the opportunity for folks that aren't able to attend today to watch this at a later time. So please let folks know that is an available option. To the next slide. My mouse is slow. Okay, so for today, we do have presentations queued up for you on the safety element, the environmental justice element, as well as the housing element. And throughout that, we have opportunities for you to provide comments and questions and to fill out some polling questions that should pop up on your screen. But we've also reserved the end of the workshop for any questions and comments that you might have about the planning process, things that we weren't able to cover during the presentation as well. So that's the format of the workshop. For the sort of Zoom logistics, we do encourage you to raise your hand if you're interested in speaking during the question and answer period. So we'll identify those portions during the presentation. And if you've only joined by phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand, and then Sarah will unmute you and allow you to speak. At any time throughout this presentation, please chat questions, comments, observations, anytime to the moderator. So you'll see in the chat function, there should be in the drop down the moderator. please send the moderator those questions, and then we'll have a chance to bring up those questions and answer them during the presentation as well. If there are any technical issues, if you're unable to see the screen or things like that, also feel free to chat the moderator. As you've noticed, all attendee videos are off and they will stay off. But we will allow you all to unmute yourself and hear from you throughout this workshop. Just some basic ground rules. We encourage everyone to direct your questions and comments to us, the city and the consultant team, rather than other workshop attendees. We encourage folks to speak one at a single time and to wait your turn. So we'll be calling on you after you raise your hand. And if there's any technological difficulties, we appreciate your patience. And please go ahead and mute yourself when you're no longer speaking. So we just wanted to introduce the general plan update. So as Steve mentioned, the purpose of this workshop is to talk about the housing, safety, and environmental justice. These are chapters of the general plan. Currently, the general plan has a housing and safety chapter. Environmental justice is a new standalone chapter that's being added to the general plan per state rules. The general plan is intended to be a broad, long-range policy document that guides future development within Monterey Park. Then we wanted to give you a quick update on the housing element before we move into the safety elements. The draft housing element has been submitted to the state, the Housing and Community Development, or HCD. That was submitted in early October. It's currently available on the project's website, and we are encouraging everyone to take a look at the housing element and provide comments to this email address that you see here on your screen. And we are closing the comment period early December, so we encourage you to provide the comments throughout this month. We'll be collecting the comments that come in from the public and then responding to HCD and providing a revised version of the housing element at a later time. So for some of you, you may have been able to join our previous workshop in August. We, from workshop attendees, that there was support for facilitating additional accessory development units to improve project streamlining and make sure review timelines at the city move faster, encouraging larger units for families, preserving existing housing stock, and overall encouragement of affordable housing development. So we took these inputs and provided adjustments to the housing element, and you'll see some programs in chapter 6 of the housing element that speak to these interests from the community. And we'll also be talking a little bit more specifically about these later. We also received input on the map activity. This was a map, an online on the project website, where we showed all the sites in Monterey Park that were identified to show that the city can meet its allocation that was provided to us from the state and through SCAG, the regional government. And we received input on over 80 sites. And for the most part, the input was that these are good candidate sites. In a few cases, the sites were identified as not being good candidates. And many of those were existing multifamily housing development was already on the property. And so we removed those properties from the RENA allocation, revised the housing element, and that's what was sent along to HCD. So we appreciate those of you that were able to participate, really good input, and helped us refine our RENA allocation. I'll just pause a moment. Any comments or questions that have come through, Sarah, that we should speak to now?
There has been only one comment, and it's not directly related to our discussion, so I'll save it for a little while.
Okay. All right. Okay, so moving on to talk about the safety element. We'll talk about safety, environmental justice, and then we'll get into more details on the housing element, just so you remember sort of the flow of the workshop. So on the safety element, this is an existing chapter in the general plan. It talks about the existing hazards that could affect people and property in the city, including the risk of earthquakes, landslides, in the event there's a reservoir failure, flooding, and now we will be adding the risk of climate change on the community. State rules now require that safety elements get updated at the same time as housing element updates. This is a new requirement. There's also a new requirement to consider climate change as a hazard that could affect people and property in the city of Monterey Park. So we've prepared what's called a climate change vulnerability assessment. This is a technical report that will be posted to the project website in the next few weeks. And it identifies projected climate conditions that could have impacts, including extreme heat days. So extreme heat days in Monterey Park are days where temperatures exceed 100 degrees. Based on climate models, we're expecting to see an increase from 3 extreme heat days per year to 16 extreme heat days by mid-century, and much more by the end of the century. We also are seeing climate models predict the length of heat waves. So the heat days and consecutive days would go from 4 days to 8 days by the end of the century. There's also going to be an increase in warm nights. Now that's something to consider because usually physiologically you need the cool nights to cool down. And when the nights are not cool enough, that's when you start to see an increase in health problems, an increase in ER visits, and in some cases more death. So there are going to be an increase in warm nights ranging from 36 to 74 nights by the end of the century. There's also an expectation that storm events or heavy rain events will increase in frequency and intensification, which could result in stormwater flooding. And on the flip side, an extension of drought conditions. California has experienced drought. That's not something new, but what we're expecting to see is a lengthening of the drought condition, which could have impact on water availability, utility rates, and has some implications on air quality as well. And then with increasing temperature comes increasing ozone, which is a pollutant. With longer extended drought years, it also increases dust, which has an effect on air quality. Plus, there's the wildfires in the region that could increase in severity and extent, which would contribute to air issues even in Monterey Park. The types of impacts we could start to see is public health issues, increase in ER visits, power outages on extreme heat days or from storm events that knock down utility lines, stormwater flooding, damage to road, transit closures from extreme heat days, increased water rates, and impacts to parks and trees in terms of because of extended drought conditions. The vulnerability assessment report focuses particularly on vulnerable populations, community members that are most at risk to climate change. And this slide shows a list of those populations we found in Monterey Park. And then we also identified the types of impacts that could occur to what are called so-called assets. These are built and natural assets in Monterey Park, including transportation, utility lines, stormwater services in parks and open space. That's a quick summary. This is sort of explaining the problems that climate change could provide to Monterey Park. I recognize this can be pretty overwhelming. What the safety element will do is include policies and programs for the city to try to build resilience and anticipate these types of impacts so that the impacts are minimized or the recovery from the disaster is faster and the capacity of the community to prepare is improved. So there are a variety of policies that the city can take to try to address these types of climate considerations. So now Sarah is going to put up a series of questions just to get a sense of workshop attendees and your thoughts about this climate change. And so if you could please fill out the series of questions and then I can report out on what we're hearing.
The poll is on the screen, but I have not received answers yet. And if you have a question on what one of the polling questions means, we're happy to clarify. Please just send a chat or raise your hand.
And while we're waiting for the for folks to fill out the question, did we see any other questions to you,
Yes.
Sarah? Okay.
So we had 2 questions about the map exercise. So the public community member, Linda, said that her name was not reflected in the draft housing element and was wondering if the city had received her comments. I believe in the housing element, Rima and Jason confirm, but we did not include names as part of the anonymity of responses in the housing element that we usually block out names and email addresses of participants.
That's right. We have 2 places in the housing element where we make reference to the input we've received. One is in chapter 1, which is a summary, and then there's an engagement appendix. And in both cases, we do summarize the comments that we've received, including comments that were submitted over emails, comments submitted during the workshop, via the participatory mapping exercise, and city council presentations. So we compiled those comments, but that's correct, Sarah. We didn't itemize who the comments came in from. But we can certainly confirm that the comments that had been submitted by Linda made their way into the summary.
Because she does say that on a specific page names were provided. So I'll confirm that at this time. And then she also asked if we could provide the APNs or accessory parcel numbers for the 5 sites that were removed. So if Jason could help with that effort, I would appreciate it. In the meantime, we've received a few participants in the polling question. I'd love to give a little bit more time and have a few more participants if possible.
Okay, well, we can, we have a few folks that answered, and it seemed drought is the climate change impact of most concern. And there are other safety hazards that are of concern for some folks, particularly seismic risk, earthquakes, but others indicated that climate change impacts is the most concerning. And then we see that some have experienced a hard time walking during a heat wave, not being able to run the AC as much as they'd like, and possibly some other conditions. And then in terms of potential policy solutions, there's support for home retrofits or better air conditioning resources. Thanks for those of you that participated. So yes, there are some different steps that the city can take: increasing tree plantings, establishing green roofs, using cool paving to try to reduce the heat effect, creating new green spaces, and improving access to cooling centers or personal cooling resources for those extreme heat days. So you'll see some of these policy type solutions in the safety element once it gets posted for review and comment. Okay, moving on to the environmental justice element. So as I mentioned, this is not an existing chapter of the general plan. This will be a new chapter with new policies. And environmental justice is a concept defined in the state government code, and it refers to the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people of all races, cultures, and incomes as part of the development and implementation of environmental laws and policies. The state now requires that during any general plan update that involves 2 chapters or more to include an environmental justice element. if there is a community considered disadvantaged, and I'll define that here in a second. The disadvantaged communities is a census tract that experiences environmental pollution and is an area of concentration with people that are either low income, high unemployment, low levels of home ownership, high rent burden, sensitive populations, or low levels of educational attainment. And so the state produced a website called CalEnviroScreen that ranked all the census tracts in California, looked at pollution burden, and looked at socioeconomic characteristics. And the census tracts that ranked the highest in terms of this combination, the high 25%, are considered disadvantaged. And in Monterey Park, there is one census tract considered disadvantaged by the state. And that is this one located to the south of the city near East LA College. So for that reason, the city is preparing an environmental justice element to not only look at the pollution burden in this community, but to also look at it throughout the city. And so there's a technical report that will be posted to the project website that provides a lot of detail. I'll give you a few highlights today on pollution burden, socioeconomic characteristics throughout the city, kind of broken up into different census tracts. Okay, so one aspect that we evaluate is air quality. And ozone is produced by cars and industrial operation. It's known to trigger wheezing and shortness of breath and can worsen asthma conditions. And groups that are sensitive to ozone include children, elderly, and people with respiratory disorders. And in Monterey Park, it's moderate level of ozone pollution. But we also looked at diesel particulate matter, which also comes from cars and trucks. And we noticed the disparity in exposure to diesel. You can see the darker colored census tracts, for the most part, follow the location of the freeways that surround the city. The lighter census tracts towards the center that are further away from the freeways. Also have evaluated park access to see if there is a even distribution of parks and if there is an adequate amount of parks in the city. Based on the California Statewide Park Program, there's a threshold of having 3 acres of parkland per 1,000 people as a threshold to strive for. And we found in Monterey Park, 76% live in areas with less than 3 acres of park or open space. There are a number of other conditions that we examined, including food access, safe and sanitary homes, the rate of physical activity, community engagement, as well as access to public facilities. So a lot of these details will be in the report. We just wanted to give you kind of a quick rundown for today. Okay, another chance to fill out some questions on your screen. And then after that, we'll get back into the housing element in detail. Just 2 questions this time about what conditions impact your health or quality the most in the city. And the next question are, what are the most important issues the city should address? Okay, so while we're waiting for folks to fill this out, Sarah, any new questions or comments that came your way?
So there was a comment about that the safety element, particularly for climate, should address reduction of carbon emissions as well as the heat mitigation, and just had a critique of the polling questions focusing more on heat mitigation than carbon emissions. So thank you for the comment for the climate. And then in terms of the polling questions, I know that we were intending to focus on experiences of the impacts of climate to see if people had started to experience it, but I appreciate the feedback.
He is intending to update the climate action plan, which includes the greenhouse gas reduction actions. There's also a chapter in the general plan called the sustainable community that looks at policy strategies to reduce greenhouse gas. There's co-benefits to a lot of the approaches to being more resilient to climate change that could reduce greenhouse gas, and we could certainly call those out. So thank you for your input.
Great. And receiving a good amount of participation in the polling questions. So thank you all for taking the time. I'm going to give it just a little bit longer and then be able to end the poll.
I think we've got a good participation. So the first question, what's impacted your health or quality the most? We have almost all indicated air pollution was the most impactful, followed thereafter by noise and the lack of good sidewalks, bike lanes, or transit, and the lack of affordable housing. The most important issues for the city to address, air pollution ranked the highest, followed by access to affordable housing and access to bikes, sidewalks, and parks. So really appreciate you filling those out, those questions. Okay, now we're going to, so before I move on to housing, so some of the policy solutions can look at establishing standards for engagement as part of city projects and plans to be, to pull in more community members than have been historically engaged in civic plans, promoting green building practice to improve indoor air quality, looking at increasing tree canopy in disadvantaged communities and improving walking and biking. There's also many other solutions that you'll see in the draft environmental justice elements, and we look forward to your review and input. Okay, with that, we're going to turn to Jason to talk about the housing element.
All right, thank you, Rima. Good evening, everybody. So we're moving to the housing element now. So as you may remember from the first housing element update workshop on August 5th, the housing element is part of the city's general plan and is required to be updated every 8 years. The city of Monterey Park is currently updating the housing element in order to meet the state requirement. So this housing element update will be the 6th cycle, which will cover the period from 2021 to 2029. And this housing element requires certification from HCD. So the city's housing element has a strong relationship with the city's land use element, which establishes how land could potentially be used in the city. So Monterey Park recently updated their land use element last year, which changed allowable land use and intensity of development. And the voters agreed to these changes in November of 2020. So now it's time for the housing element to be updated, and the housing element needs to show that there is adequate land in the city to meet the city's housing needs. So no changes to the land use designations or zoning districts are necessary for this housing element update. So there's a few objectives that this housing element hopes to achieve. The first one is to create a plan that accommodates housing for community members from all socioeconomic segments, to preserve and improve existing housing for affordable housing throughout the city, remove unreasonable government barriers that prevent housing development, and to ensure equal housing opportunity for all. So all these goals work together to achieve the overarching goal of the housing element to provide housing that is accessible to all. So the housing element is organized into 6 chapters and 3 technical appendices. The introduction provides a general overview of the city and what methods of public participation and input were used during the housing element update process. Chapter 2, which is the needs assessment, includes socioeconomic demographics and housing stock characteristics of Monterey Park and the region as a whole. And this information is generally taken from census data. The housing constraints chapter analyzes the various governmental, non-governmental, and environmental housing constraints to determine where barriers may exist that can impede housing development. So a government constraint could include limits on development imposed by cities' development code, lengthy application processes, or excessive development fees. A non-governmental constraint would be market characteristics like high cost of land or high construction costs. And then environmental constraints include any natural hazard risks such as flood zones or endangered species habitat that might limit where housing can be placed. So the next chapter, the housing resources chapter, provides an analysis of the housing resources in Monterey Park. And this chapter provides detailed information on where and how the city could accommodate future housing to meet the city's housing need. The next chapter, the review of the past accomplishments chapter, evaluates how effective the housing programs adopted in the 2014 to 2021 housing element were in facilitating housing services. And finally, the housing plan includes the development of goals, policies, and programs to address housing needs. This chapter also includes resources to achieve these goals, such as federal resources and state financing that is available to builders and cities looking to finance residential projects. So we'll move on into a little bit of detail about the housing plan. So the housing plan, which is the 6th chapter of the housing element, identifies the city's goals, policies, and implementation program. The overall strategy is to include programs that cover the following 5 themes: conserving and improving existing housing, removing barriers to housing development, providing adequate housing sites, assisting in the development of affordable housing, and promoting fair housing practices. So each of these themes addresses the following major issue areas of either construction, conservation, rehabilitation, or administration of housing. So we encourage everybody to review the housing plan and the rest of the housing element as well, as it includes a number of extensive policies and programs that impact housing in Monterey Park. Slide, please. So here are a few examples of housing programs currently in the housing element. So, and they address a few of these kind of big questions. So how do we protect existing affordable housing? So program 2, which is called conservation of at-risk housing, states that the city would monitor certain developments that are at risk of converting from affordable to market rate and ensures that tenants have access to affordable housing information offered by the city. Will there be revisions to zoning and land use? So program 6, Monterey Park Municipal Code, will ensure that the city makes any necessary changes to the zoning code to be consistent with the housing element and land use element. And as part of this program, the city will also review multifamily residential parking standards and parking standards in the downtown area to determine if any changes are necessary to further facilitate housing development. So the third topic, so how do we promote resource areas in Monterey Park? So program 7, ensuring adequate sites to accommodate regional fair share of housing growth, would require the city to closely monitor the properties set aside to meet the housing allocation to make sure the units assumed for each property are being fulfilled by actual developments. The city would also provide technical assistance and information on available parcels for lower income developments. And then continuing on, a couple more examples here. Which programs support ADUs or accessory dwelling units? So program 11, accessory dwelling units, would waive development fees for ADUs under certain conditions to facilitate ADU development. And it would also continuously monitor the production of ADUs in the city. And how do we prevent race and housing discrimination? So program 18, which is called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, would ensure that the city coordinates with fair housing organizations to increase outreach and education relating to fair housing, and would aim to reduce housing barriers related to racial inequalities, high housing cost, and increase public awareness on fair housing resources available to the city. And then there are 3 appendices. So in addition to the 6 chapters that we stated previously. So Appendix A details the community engagement summary that was used as part of the housing element update. So this includes all the mailers and flyers that were sent out, newspaper ads, email lists to important stakeholders, as well as the participatory mapping activity. And then Appendix B, which is the housing sites inventory, details the lists of vacant and non-vacant sites within the city that could accommodate future residential development. And then Appendix C is the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing analysis, which is also AFFH for short. And it includes a robust analysis of fair housing on the regional and local level. So we'll get into this Appendix C next.
Before we do that, there was one question about the housing programs. Before we move too far ahead, I wanted to give the opportunity to answer this question. So the question was in regards to the comment, no changes to land use designations or density. It says in the draft program 7 on pages 6-10 states that an increase in density in the R3 zone is necessary to accommodate lower income units and ensure consistency with the general plan, see program 6. So their question is, will R3 zone no longer have a density increase?
So the increase that's required is part of the zoning code. So the land use element already states a density of 30 units per acre for that R3 zone. But the R3 density in the zoning code needs to be bumped up to 30 from 25 to be consistent with the land use element. So that would be a change to the zoning code.
Thank you. And we received a couple other comments about housing, but I'll let us keep going through the affirmatively furthering fair housing and then come back to the public comments.
Okay.
Just a minute.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So in April of 2021, HCD provided extensive guidance to analyze the local and regional fair housing conditions across the state. These practices are intended to gather and establish programs in order to combat existing housing discrimination, eliminate racial bias, undo historical patterns of segregation, and lift barriers that restrict access. So the ultimate goal of this fair housing analysis is to foster inclusive communities, achieve racial equity, fair housing choice, and opportunities for all residents of Monterey Park. Okay, so the first category of the analysis to fair housing is the fair housing enforcement and outreach. So this category relates to the ability of Monterey Park to disseminate information related to fair housing and to provide outreach and education to community members to stay informed of fair housing laws and the rights of tenants. And it also requires the enforcement of outreach capacity and the ability for the city to address compliance with housing laws, such as investigating complaints and engaging in fair housing testing. So through our analysis of fair housing, we found that Monterey Park mainly collaborates with local agencies or local organizations, around in the Los Angeles County area, like the Housing Rights Center, to promote fair housing services, organize workshops, and disseminate information. We found that overall, disability-related discrimination is the most prevalent in Los Angeles County, comprising of about 53% of all cases. So we have a few questions here on the slide on the topic of enforcement and outreach. So if there's anyone interested in responding, please raise your hand or type in a response directed to the moderator. And a few ground rules, please direct your questions and comments to the city and consultant team rather than other workshop attendees, one person at a time. Please mute yourself if you are not speaking. Please be respectful and recognize that everyone has different opinions. And with that, the first question. So are you aware of discriminatory housing practices in the city? So Sarah, just let us know if anyone raises their hand or if anyone is commenting in the chat.
Yes, so we've received a couple of comments, so I'll catch up on that and we'll keep looking for raised hands. At the moment, we don't have any raised hands. So for the first comment about housing, they would also still like a follow-up for the 5 APNs removed for the mapping activity. So we'll follow up here shortly with that. There is a comment that most of the undeveloped land at Monterey Park that can be prime locations for new housing developments are privately owned. How does the housing plan address removing these barriers, such as eminent domain, and or promote housing development on these properties?
So the APN, I think we could provide that via email after this meeting. I don't think that's something we can pull up immediately, but we can certainly provide the parcel numbers for the sites that were removed based on input through the participatory mapping. So the person who commented, please provide your email address to the moderator and then we'll follow up.
Okay.
As to undeveloped sites, we did identify a small number of vacant properties that had the land use designation zone already in place that allowed for housing. And for those sites, we do assume a certain number of residential units. But more generally, in terms of removing constraints, the approach is more to look at what constraints are in place through the zoning code. If there's height limits, too much parking requirements, the development process is too onerous, complicated, too long, if there's any impact fees. That's kind of the approach we took, not assuming that the city would become a affordable housing developer. It's more that the city would facilitate that opportunity for the market to come in and provide affordable housing. That's kind of the overall framing. Now, Jason, if you want to speak to specific programs too.
Are there any other comments on this first question?
Yeah, so there is a comment of discrimination occurs in the housing market every day, and specifically states that the city of Monterey Park has produced almost no deed restricted affordable housing in decades. In effect, low income renters and home buyers are being discriminated against due to the city's failure to incentivize, invest in, and improve affordable housing. So clearly some opinion and perspective there, but generally trying to have maybe some perspective on the deed restricted affordable housing programs.
Thank you for your comment on that. Any raised hands?
No raised hands at this point. And then that was the last one related to affirmatively furthering fair housing. So we can follow up a little bit with explaining that have you been familiar with the Housing Rights Center or used their services? Has that service or the City of Monterey Park been helpful in explaining your rights as a renter or as a tenant, landlord, being able to have that information available to you as a community member? Not seeing any comments on that, so I'll let people trickle in and we can move into the next slide.
Okay.
Okay. So the second category of analysis in this AFFH section is called integration and segregation patterns and trends. So this category requires collecting and analyzing local and regional data to determine any patterns of segregation, whether it be related to race, disabilities, familial status, or income. And so a few findings we found throughout our analysis is that residents of Asian descent are the predominant ethnic group concentrated in the northern western portions of the city, and then followed by Hispanic residents concentrated in the southern portion. We found that there are approximately 6,211 Monterey Park residents living with at least one disability. We found that there are census tracts located in the northern section of the city that have high concentrations of single female headed households with children. And we found that median household income in Monterey Park is generally lower north of Garvey Street. And again, we go into much more detail in the AFFH section. So I encourage you all to look at that and read through it. So we have a few more questions to determine your impressions on segregation or integration in Monterey Park. So the first question, do you feel that Monterey Park is segregated in any way based on these categories?
I'm monitoring the chat and the raised hands, and there are no raised hands and have not received chats directed to integration or segregation at this time.
Okay. Okay. I'll read the next two and see if we get any questions. Do you believe that there are any concentrated areas of poverty in Monterey Park? And do you believe there are any concentrated areas of affluence in Monterey Park?
Okay, we have one hand raised for Edwin's son, so just give me 1 second and I will ask to unmute you. Yes, you're unmuted at this time, Edwin.
There are very serious concentrations of affluence in Monterey Park. I live near Garvey Ranch Park. Much of Monterey Park consists of areas like my neighborhood. We live in the hills. We're quite far from the transit corridors, making it difficult for literally people down the hills to reach our neighborhoods. My neighborhood has a lot more parks than other neighborhoods. And you asked us to not address our fellow residents with our comments, but the fact of the matter is that the other residents who live in my single family neighborhood very much want to protect their property values and their views and their street parking, and don't want to allow more housing, more affordable housing, and even some market rate housing in neighborhoods like ours, the wealthy neighborhoods. And they don't want to help other people, other neighbors who might want to live in our neighborhood and enjoy the good schools, plentiful parks, good air, even as you showed on the Cal Enviro screen. So there are concentrated areas of affluence in Monterey Park. My neighbors are keeping other people out of these areas, and I'm here to call them out on it.
Thank you for your comments and your input. We appreciate that. Anyone else raise their hand?
No other hands are raised. And there are no other comments or questions in the chat related to this topic.
So the next category of the analysis is disparities in access to opportunities. So this category requires collecting and analyzing local and regional data to identify barriers in fair housing access, such as access to education, employment, transportation, and healthy environment. So a few of our findings, we found that between 2014 and 2018, 48% of households in the city with school-age children experience high housing cost burden. And we found that in the northeast segment of Monterey Park, there's relatively lower job accessibility than in the rest of the city. We found that Monterey Park has a smaller percentage of residents utilizing public transit as a mode of transportation to work than Los Angeles County as a whole. And we found that the northern portion of Monterey Park is less impacted by pollution burden than communities located in the southern portion of the city. So we have one question here regarding regarding access to opportunities. So do you have any policy recommendations to maintain and expand access to fair housing opportunities in Monterey Park? Open that up. I'll follow up with that one by asking, has anyone had a hard time accessing any of these opportunities? Or know someone who has?
I'm monitoring the chat and raised hands, and no one has raised their hands or added comments to these questions.
Okay. So the final category of analysis is disproportionate housing needs. This category analyzes the risk of displacement. The concern of displacement is that it will lead to overpayment and cost burden when finding new housing, and overcrowding in housing in order to make housing affordable. So a few of our findings in our analysis, we found that the highest levels of cost burden are located in the northeastern segment of the city, where at least 60% of renters are burdened by housing costs. And in Monterey Park, there are lower percentages of overcrowding when compared to nearby cities such as Rosemead, San Gabriel, and El Monte. And we have a couple more questions here. Are you now, or have you ever been at risk of losing your house? And I'll ask the second one as well. Do you have any additional policy recommendations to maintain affordable housing supply in Monterey Park? So I'll open that up to the group.
So no requests for being unmuted, and no updates to the chat at this point.
Okay. So moving on to the meaningful actions portion of the AFFH analysis. So according to HCD, affirmatively furthering fair housing means to take meaningful actions in addition to combating the discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. So we have a few meaningful actions that we've incorporated into the housing element that are meant to address any contributing factors that we find that lead to impeding fair housing. So we'll go through a list of a few examples that we have here. So one is to expand education and outreach on fair housing laws and resources and providing that information in multiple languages through multiple media outlets. Include fair housing information online, also in multiple languages to make it accessible for everyone. Expand fair housing services available to the city and expand access to these services. Host annual workshops, again, in multiple languages and at multiple times a day to try to accommodate everyone's schedules. And then moving on and continuing with these meaningful actions. So incentivize housing development specifically for residents with special needs, providing equal access to information by putting the information on the city's website, again, in multiple languages. Utilize zoning, permit streamlining efforts, fees, incentives, and other approaches to increase housing choices and affordability. And offer permit streamlining, fee reduction, and expand funding to encourage development of lower income housing. So those are just a few of the meaningful actions that we've incorporated to address any findings that we saw. And with that, I will shift it back to Rima.
Mhm. So
Thanks, Jason. And I do see someone raise their hands.
yes, thank you. I was going to do two things. One, remind all people calling in that to use the *6 in order to raise their hand. So if you are trying to participate and you are over the phone, please remember that there are a couple of options for you, including the *6. And then Linda has requested to have her hand raised. So I'm asked to unmute.
Hi, I'm sorry. I wanted to make a comment in the slide before, but I couldn't find the raise hand option. But in regards to any additional policy recommendations, I wanted to suggest that the city look into an inclusionary housing ordinance to ensure that any proposed new residential developments are coming into the city with set aside a percentage of affordable housing for lower income households. Also, since we're talking about a risk of displacement, I'm really concerned about how a majority of the sites in the site inventory identifies small sites, but also a majority of these small sites are existing residential units that currently have tenants living in them. I would like to ask the city to reevaluate how effective it is to identify these sites as opportunity sites for affordable housing. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for your comments. Sarah, anyone else raise their hand or comments come in?
So there was one more comment about housing just in general of a community member finding it interesting that Monterey Park has a program dedicated to promoting accessory dwelling units. When the 2020 calendar year, there were 0 applications submitted, permitted, or entitled for accessory dwelling units. I was just wondering if the city or had a comment on the disparity.
Yeah, I can respond to that one. So there has been actually quite a large number of ADUs that have been permitted in 2020 and are in the process of being reviewed in 2021. So with the change in state law, we're seeing a lot more increased activity with regards to the accessory dwelling units that are being built or proposed in the city.
Great, thank you. And that's the last of the comments related to housing. There's one other comment remaining, but I'll save that for the general question and answer period at the end. And let us keep moving forward since there are no other hands raised or chats.
Okay, we just have a few more slides and then we can open up to any questions related to the topic of this workshop. So just to quickly review the schedule. are right about here. So this is the second and last community workshop. The housing element has been available on the project website for about a month now and will continue until early December. The safety and environmental justice elements and technical reports that I mentioned will be available in the next few weeks, and you should be receiving an email blast that identifies when they're posted to the website. So we encourage you to review them and provide comments to the city. And the state is in the process of reviewing the draft housing element and will provide comments in early December, and the revisions will be made. A revised housing element will be issued, and then the city council will have a public hearing to review and potentially adopt the housing, safety, environmental justice elements. We also have an addendum to the land use element EIR. It's kind of a CEQA, an environmental document that evaluates the potential impacts of these 3 chapters of the general plan. That will also be available for public review. So here it is more itemized out. We have this comment period on these elements and the CEQA addendum, and then the closing period for the housing element is just. So just so everyone has it, we wanted to provide the email address or contact number. If folks want to ask questions after this workshop's concluded, if you want to see updates or materials, please visit the project website. And Sarah just sent a message to the chat with this information. So thank you all for participating. We do want to reserve time for just broad question and answer. I think I'll stop sharing my slide deck, and then that way people can just raise their hand and or continue to provide comments and questions to the moderator.
Hi, this is Linda. I just wanted to thank staff for putting on this workshop. I'm really excited to be able to participate in this process because I believe there's an opportunity to shape our housing production in the next decade. As the draft indicates, 75% of our renters are lower income households, and our housing element needs to be more effective and strategic in addressing the unmet housing needs for lower income households. On Monday, I sent a comment letter to MPK housing update at montereypark.ca.gov, and I didn't receive a confirmation from staff, and I was hoping if someone can confirm receipt of my comment letter. And also, this is just the first draft, so I anticipate there will be additional drafts coming in. So as the city moves forward in updating the element, I would like to request that the city consider providing a red line version of the revised draft to allow the public to easily identify what the track changes are, just to be more transparent, to just allow the public an easier way to look at the draft, the revised draft. Also, it would be helpful if an Excel version of the site inventory is provided to the public so that we can filter the information that we want to analyze on our end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your input. Any other raised hands or comments that have come through?
No other raised hands, and I will include the question that was asked at the very beginning that was less related to housing, environmental justice, and only slightly related to safety. So just a comment that there were 2 traffic fatalities at the intersection of Garvey and Atlantic within the past month, and was just asking if elected officials and staff what their level of concern was for pedestrian deaths considering these recent circumstances. So it's less related to this project, so I'll give Steve a chance to respond.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with it, and maybe Frank might be able to respond better than I could, because that's I'm new with the city, so I'm not quite sure what happened with those.
Okay, I'm asking Frank to unmute. So thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, so the question was just stating that there were 2 traffic fatalities at the intersection of Garvey and Atlantic, and they would
Oh,
just like to
sorry,
know
yes.
the city's perspective on pedestrian safety.
Well, obviously, we can't comment on on those incidents as there's active investigations. However, we take pedestrian safety very seriously. We frequently inspect both our crosswalks. We refresh the paint. We make sure we're up to current standard. We have a project that will be refreshing all crosswalks at schools that'll be coming up in the next fiscal year. And otherwise, we think we meet all standards, and we continue to work again to improve. So we're working on several traffic signals that will update the pedestrian signal heads. Yeah, I'm not sure how much more I can say regarding that. Again, we
Sorry.
can't comment on those 2 incidents, but
Thanks, Frank. I was just gonna, say, we appreciate the comments. This is Inez Alvarez, Assistant City Manager. But unfortunately, since those incidents are under investigation, as Frank mentioned, we can't really comment too much more in detail. Frank, there was a question though from Linda that was prior. I'm not sure if you caught it. She was just confirming that we received her letter from the MPK housing email. If we could confirm for her that we received that, she just wants to ensure that her comments were received. Thank you.
okay, we'll do. We'll confirm.
Okay, great. And Linda has her hands right. Okay.
I had one more question. I know the city is relying on a lot of small sites and lot consolidation to accommodate the lower income need. I just wanted to get some feedback or what your thought process on why the majority of the parcels in the consolidated lots are not contiguous. Also, I noticed that some of I'm sorry, my daughter's screaming. I hope you don't hear her, but that some of the consolidated sites include parcels that are for lower income, moderate income, and above moderate income. And I just wanted to get, again, your thoughts or some feedback as to why you're including all the income levels to identify like one consolidated lot. If that makes sense.
So I think this question, thank you for providing it. Jason, if you could speak to lot consolidation and then the income categories.
Right. So our methodology with identifying sites, so we looked through the city and we identified the sites in the areas that would yield the highest density. And in Monterey Park, it is those areas, mixed use density, and then also just high density residential zoning. So the rules for identifying lower income sites passed down by HCD is the site has to be at least 30 units per acre. So in Monterey Park, we were limited with where we could identify sites that had the current zoning to accommodate those lower income sites. So that's why we identified the sites in those areas, identifying areas that could be mixed use and things like that. And then remind me what your second question was.
She was asking about how come the lots that were flagged for consolidation were not contiguous.
Not contiguous.
So I don't think we identified which lots would need consolidation, but we did show that there are a number of small parcels that we anticipate would need consolidation in order to actually facilitate the densities we're anticipating. And so one of the housing element programs that we're recommending in the draft is for the city to put together a lot consolidation program that incentivizes property owners and developers to purchase properties and consolidate and have a larger land area for development. We were responsive to your questions and comments, Linda. Any other comments coming in, Sarah?
No new comments, and I re-reviewed the chat, and we have addressed all comments and questions at this time. And there are no additional raised hands. So you can give another moment if last minute questions over the chat or raising your hand. Otherwise, we are available. Oh, Linda, one more question.
Yes, one last question. What about city-owned sites? It seems like the site inventory identifies city-owned sites, but for moderate and above moderate, I was wondering why we can't prioritize lower city-owned sites for lower-income households. Because it's city-owned, I think we can leverage the land more for affordable housing. Thank you.
Yeah, that's generally true with the city-owned sites. The city has more leverage on what they can do. Again, if it was identified for a different income category, a moderate or above moderate, it was likely because that's what the underlying zoning was for that site.
Right, and HCD rules indicate a certain density standard in how you allocate your sites. It does not preclude affordable housing development from occurring. It's just that there's an assumption made that affordable housing does not occur unless your density is at least 30 units per acre per the code. So affordable housing developers can certainly still move forward. It's just kind of the way the state rules work and the methodology is set up.
Yeah, and building on that again, the sites inventory is a capacity analysis. We just need to prove to the state that the city has the capacity based on the underlying zoning in the city that they can reach their RHNA numbers for all the income categories. If they don't have the capacity in the city, then they would need to rezone certain areas. So that's what we have to prove with the sites inventory analysis.
Thank you. And that was the last of our questions. One was to me directly about signing up for the email list. So thank you for providing your email address. Have received a couple of emails, so there will be some follow-up, as well as information on the recording and being able to access that information on the website. So thank you for your participation this evening.
Thank you. Steve, do you want to close out the workshop with some concluding remarks?
Sure, thank you so much. I would like to thank everybody for participating and attending, spending a couple hours with us to give us your ideas and hearing what we had to say. And particularly like to thank the planners at Rincon for making a very complicated subject more understandable and easier for the public to understand. This concludes all of our workshops for the housing element. We'll be moving through the process of getting the element approved. We'll take the comments that were presented tonight and make them a part of the housing element update. We'll conclude with the stopping the recording now. Is that correct? I believe. And we just want to make sure that you guys still have an opportunity to participate in the future. If you want to come back, you can go to the website at the MPK housing update at montereypark.ca.gov. The phone number you can call is 626-307-1315. And so there's still opportunities to participate and get the word out to us if you'd like to. You can just contact the planning department at City Hall also if you don't remember these numbers or anything like that, and let us know what your thoughts are. I think at the website, the mpkhousingupdate.com will provide you a lot more information that you have. And this recording that was made tonight will be made available on the project website in case people who weren't able to attend tonight's meeting and want to participate or look at it, they can go from there. So that kind of wraps it up for us. And we'll turn it back over to you. Thank you guys so much.
Okay, thank you all very much. Hope everyone has a great evening. We appreciate your attendance tonight and your feedback.
I'm sorry, we just wanted to suggest, we were looking back for that through that email. If Linda, if you could resend that email, we just want to make sure that we did receive it. So if you could resend it to the MPK, we definitely will have staff confirm that they receive it. But in this situation, we weren't able to find it. So we just want to make sure that we don't miss it. Thank you.
Thanks, Inez.
All right, Linda said she'll resend the email. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.